Welcome to the Project Endure podcast, the place where we talk about life, endurance, persistence, perspective, and so much more. I'm Joe Rinaldi, and I'll be your host. Let's jump in. Welcome to episode 2 of the Project Endure podcast. This is weird because we have myself, Joe Rinaldi. We have Coach Sam Tooley, and this is a different podcast. Sam, how are you?
I think I'm on the wrong podcast. No, I'm good, man. Good. Excited to kickstart this with you and see where you take it.
Thank you, man. I appreciate it. And as I was telling you before we recorded, the reason I wanted you on the podcast as the first guest is because I feel like you really embody what Project Endure is all about. And it's having conversations about real things, about tough things that happen to people, how they deal with those things, move forward, and then continue to seek out hard things in the pursuit of being the best versions of themselves. So as I was saying, I think there's a lot of crossover between our podcast, which is the Pursuit podcast, and this podcast. But really, I just want to almost pretend like I don't know your story and just ask you about it. And we'll go from there. So why don't you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, no, I think it'll be good to rehash the story as if you don't know it, because anytime I tell, kind of go through it in full, which I've done a little bit more as of recent, than I've been accustomed to, new stuff always comes up. So I'm excited to dive into it. But for those who maybe don't listen to Joe and my podcast together or aren't familiar, my name is Sam Tooley. I'm 29 in Westfield, New Jersey, which is Joe and my hometown. Still, I would say I'm still probably the singular 29-year-old left in town, but not the worst place to be. Grew up playing every sport under the sun, landed on track and field and cross country, made a name for myself in that world for a period of time, and fortunately came back to it. To coach, endurance athletes all over the world, from first-time half marathoners and first-time marathoners to Olympic trial qualifiers. And so that's been my bread and butter, and really what kind of started as my first true business. And then that leaked over into owning brick and mortar gyms. So now I own a handful of those. I own the Garage Gym, which is a 24/7 kind of private membership gym, where quite frankly, I get to hide out from the masses and do my own training. I own a concept called Alpha Fit Club, which is expanding all over the state, hopefully all over the country soon enough, which is a group fitness concept, a strength and conditioning circuit style badass class, kind of a city inspired workout brought to the suburbs, and a youth training facility called the Academy, which really just, we wanted to create a hub for young athletes to improve off the field and have a real impact on the field. So that's kind of my day in, day out job. I work with a lot of phenomenal brands, from Athletic Brewing to Spartan and things of that nature, and still competing at a pretty high level. So trying to dabble with everything from the Spartan deck of fits to High Rocks and everything in between, you name it. I've done it, Ironman, ultras, half marathons, and road races. So there's a lot going on, but at the end of the day, I'm the same goofy goober that I've always been, and somebody who's just figuring it out as I go, but pretty determined to do exactly that. So that's where we are today.
Just an awesome introduction. And as you would say, I've probably heard this phrase at least 48 times on our podcast. You've got a lot of pots on the stove, and they're all challenging, I'm sure, in their own unique ways. But before we dive into the hard things that you're doing today, one of the questions that I want to ask every guest on this podcast, and I think I do know your answer, but I'll have you tell it to the audience. What is the hardest thing that you've been handed in life, and how have you dealt with it? And I guess you can take that however you want, tell your story, start wherever makes the most sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. Joe was kind enough to send me the questions before we hopped on, so I had some time today to think a little bit more than I typically would. And it's not difficult to answer, right? But there's a lot of different ways to go about answering it. And so, for I'm going to start from the beginning, Joe, because I think it's just there's the context matters, right? And the journey kind of helps paint the picture a little bit. So, as I mentioned, I grew up, playing every sport under the sun. I eventually was able to find running, which for me became an outlet, and quite frankly, an outlet that I never knew I needed. I grew up in from the outside looking in to have the picture perfect family with the picture perfect situation. And like most people, and specifically in our town, an affluent suburb in New Jersey, you don't know what goes on behind the scenes. And at the time, I didn't realize other people had problems like I had at home. And so, when I was 15, 16 years old, home was the last place that I wanted to be. I had a really broken kind of home life. I had, an eventual divorce between my parents. I had addiction within my family, and I just didn't want to be home. And so at that time, right, that was the hardest thing that I ever had to deal with was just this internal rage. I don't want to even call it anger. I want to call it rage, because I was just so pent up with frustration and anger that I couldn't resolve this issue in my family. And yet at the time, I put on the Superman cape and I wanted to take care of my parents. I wanted to take care of my brother. I wanted to put on the smile, and I wanted to perform, and I wanted to be liked by everybody, right? When you're in your own little world, whatever problem you're facing, I think oftentimes feels immense, right? It feels like it's the biggest deal in the world. And then, as things progress throughout my life, looking back, I don't discount the struggles that I was dealing with them, but they definitely became smaller in scope, right? And so that's why I wanted to give that context, is that was at the time the hardest thing that I ever had to deal with. I had to watch my family essentially disintegrate in my face, right? And I remember writing letters to my parents being like, why are you doing this? Like, why can't you just stop? Like, whatever. And having to really just be a chameleon in my own family to make sure that everybody was good. And even though I had the best parents and the best brother and the best support system, whatever, I was just broken. And unfortunately, I took this broken soul off to college with me. And unfortunately, I didn't have the outlet that I once had. I lost my love for running. My priorities shifted. I think as you go from being a teenager who's kind of got it all, and in terms of a support structure and system, goals that are laid out for you, a path that seems to be the only one. When that freedom came into play at college and there was really no rules, I love that, right? And that kind of all-in mentality that I had took over again, and without that outlet. So I very quickly just turned to being the party guy and wanted to be the drunkest guy in the room, the loudest guy in the room, the one that everybody wanted at the party. And the first few years of college, it was very much that. I had the time of my life, and I made some of my best friends to this day. But unfortunately, eventually that runs out. And that kind of front that I was putting on, that internal struggle eventually became external, and people could see it. And by the time I was a junior, I was kicked out of college. I got let back in. I was dealing drugs. I was blacked out every day. And I was really at my lowest point. I was depressed. I had anxiety. I, had suicidal thoughts, you name it. And again, in that moment, that was the hardest thing that I had ever dealt with, because I felt like, I was in this bottomless pit. I felt like I was in this hopeless situation, and I truly did not see a way out of it. So again, like, life progresses, life evolves, I evolve with it, but unfortunately in this case for the worst. And that was a struggle, and then there was a tipping point. And I was a fifth year senior. I was working at a dump as a garbage man. I was living in an unfinished basement. These are all chapters in a book, right? These are all chapters in a story that we could have an hour-long podcast about each one, right? And probably one day should. But there came a point in time, I was a 5th-year senior. Again, I was clearly not doing very well. And I found myself in a unique situation where I was visiting a family member in rehab. We had done an intervention, again, dating back to home life. And we did an intervention and brought them to rehab. And during a family visit, right, a family visitation visit, we had a weekend where we had to learn about addiction. It's the first time in my life that I'd really ever come to understand it or even look to understand it, quite frankly. And that weekend being there changed the trajectory of my life, right? Truly, I mean, it truly did. And I didn't even want to be there. I didn't even know I had to be there. But I heard a young woman share her story, and it rocked me to my core, truly shook me. And I had to leave the room. I had to go outside. I had to catch my breath. I was looking over this field in the middle of Pennsylvania. And in that moment, typically what I would do, the normal Sam Tooley response would be to brush it off, say you're all good, and go back to business, right? Probably get drunk that night at dinner and go back to the basement and go back to the dump and do life, right? And be miserable. But I had the strength in that moment. I had the courage in that moment for whatever reason. It was almost like it was put into me to go back into that room, to pull that girl aside and to say, what you just said turned my world upside down in that moment. Am I overreacting? And she said, no. We sat down for an hour. We talked, a conversation I've never had in my life before, a perspective that I was never, privy to. And she said, if you do not stay here, you will regret it the rest of your life. And I'm like, you want me to stay here? You want me to stay in rehab? And she said, if you leave here, it will be the biggest mistake of your life. So I fought with it that whole weekend. I was calling my dad, I was calling my buddies, and I'm like, do I stay? And I did. I ended up checking myself into rehab that weekend. Did 30 days in sober living, did 60 days in, I did 30 days in rehab, 60 days in sober living. And that 90-day period is the foundation of my mindset to this day. As I reflect on it now, do I necessarily think that I had a problem with drinking? I don't know. Do I think I had necessarily had a problem with drugs? I don't know for certain, right? But what I do know is that I had a problem with taking responsibility for my life. I had a problem with not blaming outside circumstances for where I was. And what I learned over that 90 days was to just own it. I learned that, listen, at the end of the day, and quite frankly, the first 22 years of my life probably should have taught me this, but no one is coming to save you. You can be surrounded by the most loving people in the world, but they can't do it for you. And fortunately for me, I learned that lesson. Again, that period right there, going through that journey, raising my hand saying, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I have suicidal thoughts, I can't stop drinking, I can't stop blacking out. That was the hardest thing that I was dealing with then. But luckily for me, and I don't want to say luckily, but fortunately for me, going through that process, creating that mindset, I was able to build this foundation that I didn't know I was going to need later on. So I'm not going to say that anything after that was easy, right? I got a job up in the middle of nowhere, living alone in Binghamton, New York, which is actually one of the most densely populated drug overdose places in the world. Wow. It's Broome, I think it's Broome County in New York is like up there. So here I am inserting myself into probably the lion's den. And fortunately I recognized my unhappiness and dissatisfaction with the situation. And again, fortunately, I was surrounded by amazing people and they supported me in coming home, starting this coaching journey and getting onto the path that I'm on now. As I was picking up the pieces of my life, I was tested time and time again. My biggest supporter, my biggest fan, regardless of whatever it was that I had done or was going through, my dad, the first season that I was coaching at the high school, passed away really suddenly. He had a routine neck procedure And, I woke up one day and I was sitting at the desk in my home that I grew up in. And my mom, walked over and was crying. And she's just like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, what am I doing? I'm sitting here on the computer. Why are you hysterically crying? And she said, your dad passed away last night. Like that, and just crazy, like
Yeah.
even to this day, to remember that conversation as vividly as I did, to feel it as much as I feel it. It's never easy. It's never easy. So that turned my world upside down, right? And here I was, like, genuinely so proud of, just so proud of who I was becoming for my dad. And, like that, they get taken. So clearly a super hard situation to navigate. But in that moment, I found myself in the same house where I always wore the Superman cape growing up, making sure everybody else was good. And quite frankly, like, that has always been my defense mechanism, in the sense of, okay, yes, I feel like shit. Yes, this is a shitty situation. This sucks. But how do I make sure everybody else is good? Most importantly, my brother, right? Jake was a freshman at Monmouth at the time. And, I had to go pick him up from school and tell him. And they were so close, super, super close. So that rocked us, man. And it was tough. There's no doubt. Like, that was so hard. And but I had a purpose. The purpose was show Jake, my brother, that we could keep going, and that was important. That was my purpose. Like, my purpose became show Jake what we can do, and that was all that I needed. So that year was a tremendous year of growth for me as like a man. It was stay sober, stay on point, stay on my game. Nobody at that time would have given me shit if I had gone back to how I was. I had every excuse under the sun, but I had a responsibility to Jake to show him. So I did that. I started my online coaching business. I ended up, becoming the youngest head coach in the state of New Jersey for track and field at St. Joe's and Metuchen. I started working with brands, started building, a personal brand and a reputation of somebody who just kind of rose to the occasion. And I was proud of that, man. I was. And I think when you start to get proud of who you're becoming, it makes you want to lean into that much more. It's like, I don't want to use the word addicting, but it's a little addicting when you're like, damn, you know what? Like, you're doing a good job, and man, it's crazy that this story keeps going, doesn't it? And like, we're just starting it. This was 4 years ago plus, 5 years ago now. And so, that year went on. I signed the lease to my first gym. It was a 500 square foot hole in the wall. Quite frankly, I had used the money that my dad had left, and it wasn't much, to be honest with you, but it was something, and it gave me enough of a head start to open my first gym. And I did that. And life said, okay, we see you. Let's really find out what you're made of. So 9 months after dad passed and I signed the lease to the gym, the first month that I had the gym, 3 days before my 25th birthday, woke up in the middle of the night and started coughing and started smelling smoke. I could hear, shit shattering in my house. And, I opened up my bedroom door to flames. Some of that night is buried in my brain. Others is gone, right? And I do remember punching out my window, standing on the roof. That's a vivid memory, or image rather, and literally flames spitting out of my house. A fire that you would never you could feel, And so that night we had a house fire, August 28th, and Jake passed away in the fire, and it's hard when you do believe everything happens for a reason, right? It's really hard in those moments to understand that. And that purpose that I had just was like ripped away and gone. So that was the hardest year in my life. That was that forever will be, hopefully, the hardest thing that I'll ever have to go through. Just, it's unfathomable. So to answer your question, finally, that will be, and that forever, that's the hardest thing I've ever had to go through. That next year was just rough. 1 week you're just on the couch, can't move. The next week you're like, I've got this. I've figured it, it's time to pick the pieces back up. Let's get to work. And, one thing I've always had the ability to do is work. Fortunate. So, that was kind of the ebb and flow of the year. The year was try and pick up the pieces, and try and kind of forgive myself for not being able to, the one thing that I was able to do that year though was train, and go back to that outlet that I always knew. So for whatever reason, actually, during that time period where I lost my dad, when I was setting up the gym, I had committed to doing my first Ironman down in Miami, 70.3. Obviously, when Jake passed, I canceled that race. I still went down to Miami. I saw my best friend from college do it, and was so inspired by the event, by the vibe, et cetera. And also kind of was like kicking myself for not towing the line with him. So I committed that year to doing it, and went up to Maine a year later. And on the 1 year anniversary, the day, I did my first 70.3. I absolutely fucking smashed it, and surprised myself in every aspect, and gave myself kind of permission to live life again. Felt like Jake was with me during the race. I felt like, this baggage was lifted off me. From that moment on, I would say I've been able to just seize the opportunity that I have, and quite frankly, it's as simple as just getting to do what I love, and getting to wake up every day and, just be present, be here doing it, because you've heard me say it many times, like not everybody has that opportunity. And quite frankly, like the days that I feel like quitting, like that's I don't need much of a reminder, So again, to kind of recap the question, I know I've been just going for about 20 minutes now, but every stage of our life, I think we're going to have something that tests us, right? We're going to have something that's incredibly hard, that in that moment feels hard, right? And I think the more hard things that we overcome and get through, the more perspective we have in the little shit that doesn't really matter, right? So like, let's rewind it, right? Let's say I had experienced losing a brother first. all the shit that came, reverse engineered. If everything went backwards, right? I lost Jake. And then this happened. And then that, like, and then I went to rehab. And then that, like, those things, I'd be like, whatever, right? Like, I got this because I dealt with that, right? And so it got progressively harder, right? But losing Jake was that culminating point. And quite frankly, again, like, I cannot imagine something more hard happening. So now everything's easy, relatively, right? Because I have that perspective and that context. And we say this all the time. I never wish that anybody goes through what I've gone through. But what I hope is that by now having the perspective that I do, by giving that perspective to other people, they don't need to go through it. By me telling this story and somebody hearing it and understanding what life could be like and what it could look like, they don't have to go through the trials and tribulation, the trauma and the tragedy that I have to learn the lessons that I've learned, right? And I almost feel like I have a responsibility to tell the story and embody what I've learned so that other people can recognize that and say, got it.
You tell it so well, Sam. And I mean, if we're being honest, we both cried through the past 20 something minutes. I know a couple times I had some tears coming down my face, and I've heard your story multiple times on our podcast, through your writing, and other places, but I don't think I've ever heard you tell it from beginning to now, just like that. And I really do think that somebody, probably multiple people listening to this podcast, are sitting there thinking to themselves, wow, what happened to me today that I thought was really hard and thought was really bad and that I'm upset about? Like, I'm good. Like, life is not that bad. And, I think for you, one of the things that I picked out through the story is, whether it was rehab or after the passing of your dad or Jake, like, there was support for you. And there were people around you, whether it was going to a place where people, that was their job to help, or it was people in the community lifting you up. And obviously that's carried through to today with your businesses and everything that you do. You have so many people in your corner. And so I'm curious for you, what is the advice you would have for somebody who maybe is going through something really, really hard right now and wants to find support, but maybe isn't ready or willing to ask for it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to highlight something that you said, and then I'll try my best to answer it, because listen, I've always had support, always, right? And so it's funny that I like to walk around as if I've got a chip on my shoulder and almost pretend that people are doubting me, when all I've ever been met with is support, right? So I'm incredibly appreciative of that. I and I recognize it too. I'm not foolish to it. And so I've had the upper hand since day one. Even when I was growing up, man, like, my parents, who were phenomenal, right, when it came to supporting me, my extended family, my grandparents, who I'm incredibly close with, teammates, friends, even in school, you know what I mean? Like, I wasn't bullied. Like, yeah, there were some assholes, right? But like, I put those assholes back in their place because I felt like I could, right? Like, I've always been supported. And I think when you start to show up and you do the right things for yourself, and let me rewind for a second. Even when I was at my worst in college, right, where I was depressed, anxious, not doing the right things, not going to class, dealing drugs, whatever, my friends knew who I was at my core. And they knew that I was a good person dealing with some other shit, and that I wasn't equipped enough to handle it, right? But they knew I was good in my core. So if you're listening to this and you are good in your core, if you're a good person, which I think 99% of us are, and if chances are, if you're connected with Joe and you're listening to his podcast, chances are you also fit that bill, right? Those are the credentials. The reason I said that I had courage when I raised my hand and asked for help to get sober, to really just get back on track, that to me is the definition of courage, in the sense that I didn't need to raise my hand. Nobody was forcing me into rehab. So it takes strength to one, admit to yourself first and foremost that you need help. And then it takes even more to say it out loud and to raise your hand, right? You got to summon that strength, because here's the thing, right? Let's look at it from a different lens. You can keep sitting there, sitting in your same shit, having the same conversations with yourself every morning. I wish I felt better. I wish I could lose 5 pounds. I wish that I didn't feel this way. I wish, right? No one can do it for you. It goes back to that ultimate truth that I always talk about, right? Like, you have to do it. And if you think about it, right, if you sit there and have the same conversations in your head and wallow in sorrow and whatever, right? And I've been there, I've done it. I know, I'm speaking from experience. Then that's all that's ever going to happen. And you're going to be fucking miserable. You don't need that. You don't want that. And you don't deserve that, right? But you don't deserve the help until you ask for it. That's the prerequisite. Getting help, right? No one owes that to you. You have to go get the help, just like if you want something else, right? So it's like ripping the Band-Aid. It's going to suck. It's going to sting, but it sucks a lot less sitting there frustrated and frazzled and upset, whatever, than it does getting the help from somebody who probably wants to help you. That's the best part, right? Is that when you ask, the right people come back to you and say, I got you, right? So you have two options: sit there and keep doing the same shit, feeling miserable, or rip the fucking Band-Aid and go ask for help. I'm not disputing the courage and strength it takes to go ask for it, but I am absolutely declaring that it is worth it.
Sam, since you recommended it, I'm reading the book Awareness by Anthony DeMello, and man, it is dense. It's packed. So one of the things I just came across was where he speaks about change, and how even good change is hard, because you have to change your state. You have to wake up, as he says, from a state of being asleep or being unaware of the change or unwilling to change, to actually making the change. And I think that momentum to go from one state to another, you have to break the inertia. There's tension there and you have to break it. And that's what you were just speaking to. And I think one of the questions that lends itself now is, you've been through a lot of hard stuff, a lot, like harder than anybody else that I know, but you continue to do really hard things, build businesses, make them successful, grow, train really hard, do races, push yourself. Why? Why are you doing all of these hard things still, even after you've been through so much?
You know what, man? It's a funny question. I know you posed it to me before, but I didn't really focus in on it. Joe, it feels so fucking good to put something hard in front of you. Let's just use the race analogy because it's the easiest one, right? And I'll use the Ironman, right? My first Ironman as really just a prime example of this, right? So yes, I'm an endurance athlete. My background is running. Running does come fairly naturally to me. However, I always grew up as more of like a sprinter than a long distance runner. I had the internal drive to work hard, so I was able to figure it out and do exactly that. However, I am legitimately scared of the ocean. I do not like the fact that there's tides and rip currents or rip whatever it is. I don't like that I'm not in control in the water. It scares me. I also never grew up swimming, so I had to take swim lessons, right? I never really knew how to ride a bike, not well. The first time I went riding with my buddy Cole, whose wedding I was at this past weekend, and he brought this up at the wedding, I was covered in blood because I couldn't unclip out of the bike. I fell 7 times. I was gushing in blood. And I would get up, do it again, get up, do it again. Now I was cursing in the middle of it, screaming like motherfucker this, like blah, blah, blah. And I don't know if this is a PG podcast for Joe, but we're breaking the rules early.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Yeah. So point being is like, what I think happened during that Ironman for me, to be honest with you, was it was something really hard, right? I knew that going into it. I knew it was going to be a test. I didn't know how to swim. I could barely bike. And then you wanted me to run after all that stuff. It was a 5-hour event, right? The longest I had ever done anything before that was like an hour and 23 minutes, my first half marathon, right? So point being was I knew it was hard. Everything I had done the years prior, college specifically, I was all talk. I had started businesses in college. They were good at the beginning, and then I couldn't back them up with the necessary work. I started my college, degree. I got kicked out. You name it, I never saw anything through to completion. So for me, this was the first thing since getting sober that I put something on the calendar. I verbalized it to anybody and everybody who would listen. I dedicated my days and time to it, and I put in the work. I stepped to that beach that morning and I knew that I had done that. That was the best feeling, man. I was so proud of myself for sticking it out and doing it when it was hard and getting to where I was supposed to be. So that was step one, right? Doing the work and feeling proud of it. Then I had to actually go do the damn thing, right? And I left it out there. I could not have pushed harder. So not only did I prepare for the task at hand, but I completed the task at hand without question to the best of my ability. Those two things to me were all I ever needed, right? Being proud of myself for showing up and doing whatever I could to do it, and then seeing it through to completion. Best feelings in the world. So let's extrapolate that out into other contexts, right? Saying what you're going to do and doing it. Those to me, that for me personally is a recipe for happiness, because I spent so much time not living to my potential, knowing what I was capable of, but always falling short, self-sabotaging, whatever. And finally I cracked the code. And with something that was big, something that was not like a little task, like not like saying I'm going to go do my laundry and actually fold it in the same 24 hours, but an Ironman. And for me, the switch went off and I said, that feels good. I want more of that. And I also knew that I was capable of doing it. So the reason I keep putting hard things in front of me is that it just feels good to check that box, man, to show up for yourself, to put your head down and to push. And on the other side of that is such a sense of self-satisfaction that, when I'm not putting things hard in front of me, I feel like I'm coasting, and I don't like that. I don't want to coast through life. I want to find out what I'm made of, and drawing it all the way back to Jake and to my dad is that I have an opportunity to find out what I'm made of, and I feel very responsible to do that. Again, not everybody has that, and if you do, which is everybody listening to this, I would encourage you to say wake up every single day, truly, and say, I'm going to find out what I'm capable of today. If you can attack life with that type of tenacity, you are going to be shocked at how quickly you blow everybody around you's doors off. You are in a different world when you attack life with that headspace. People won't get it. That's probably one of the hardest things, is that people won't understand it, and you'll feel a little alienated because you're operating from that place. Most people want to feel comfortable and at ease, right? That's coasting. I'm not about that.
Yeah. Sam, I'm a quote guy. The people of this podcast may or may not know that, but right. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, those who dance are considered insane by those who can't hear the music. And that's exactly what you are to me. You're dancing to the music that you just tried to describe, and hopefully people get it. But I think that for me, that's one of the hard parts too. I mean, you and I, right, we're up early, we're working hard, we're doing things that other people aren't doing for reasons that other people might not understand on the surface. And I think that could be really hard. Now, what I want to ask you is, you just described the Ironman 70.3, you prepared for it, you declared it, you did it. Last year around this time, you attempted 100 miles to Marquis Park in Westfield, New Jersey, in honor of Jake. And I was there for part of it. And you didn't complete the original goal that you set out to complete. And we talked about it on our podcast, and you've had a whole year to reflect on it. And I'm curious, in your experience, and for people listening who have attempted hard things and maybe not gotten the outcome that they had wanted, what was a takeaway for you from that experience? And is it equal to the successes, or is it even greater than the successes?
That was one of the more physically challenging things that I've ever done. I think it certainly at the time outweighed the Ironman in terms of physical, but I didn't prepare like I should have. I didn't prepare the way you need to, and so I went into it with so much emotional baggage because I was doing it for Jake that at the time when I could not complete it physically, it just was not happening. Right. We ended up having some stress fractures in my feet and things like that ended up holding me back. But at the time, man, it was crippling, not just physically, but emotionally, because I wanted to see it through for Jake. And now as I reflect back on it, right, it's still kind of a tough pill to swallow that I didn't finish it. But at the end of the day, I put my best foot forward, right? I gave it what I had on the day, and it wasn't there. Right. And so I think from that perspective, and as life progresses, like, I have matured in the standpoint of I don't deem that a failure. Right. In the moment, of course, disappointed, etc. We're all our own harshest critics, etc. So in the moment, I certainly was down, but as I took a step away from it and I started to kind of reflect on it, and I remember I actually went away the week after for a little R&R and got to clear my head. I was proud of not only the effort that I put out, but again, the ability to take a step back and say, it's okay that you didn't complete it, right? To have kind of that compassion towards myself and that context of saying, like, who cares, man? Like, really, who cares that you didn't complete the 100? Nobody else outside of you, right? So I think we live in this little bubble where we create our realities based on our perspective, and we give context and meaning to events as they unfold, right? That's an important revelation that I've had over time, is that you and I, Joe, could have the same thing happen to us on the same day in the same place. Let's just say, I'm trying to think of a great example here, but like, we're walking down the street and somebody honks at us. This is actually probably a pretty good analogy. Somebody honks at us, right? I'm going to play this out, probably how it would go down. You'd probably raise your hand and wave at him and be like, I wonder who that was. And I'm over here screaming, mother effer this, with the middle finger up. And I go, who's that? Who's honking at us? We're walking here, right? So the same thing can happen to two different people, and we can take two different things from it, right? Well, something can happen to me as an individual, and I can have two different takeaways from it, but I get to choose the takeaway. I get to choose the meaning, right? And as I was able to take a step back from that 100-mile attempt, again, what I was able to do was to contextualize it and to look at it from a different lens. Did I not complete the task at hand 100%? Did I do it as well as I could have? Yes, on a day and in that moment. And most importantly, it was the nastiest day ever. It was raining. It was windy. It was dark. And yet that park was filled up with people supporting me. And that was the takeaway that I needed that was the meaning that I needed to give to it. Was I showed up, I did the best I could, and I was supported by people who love me. I won, right? I won on that day. Mm-hmm. So an important note to give to anybody listening is, like, listen, shit is going to happen in your life. Hard things are going to be put on your plate. You have an opportunity not only to handle them, but to give them meaning, right? So be very careful with the meaning that you give to the things that happen to you or for you, or however you want to skew it, because that is what you are in control of. You're not in control of what happens. You're in control of how you respond and the meaning that you give to that situation. I forget it all the time, right? But the more that I remember it, the happier I am, because it's that powerful.
Yeah, no, so well said. And I really can't add much to that. And so, as we wrap up here, we have another podcast to record for our own podcast. I want to bring up kind of the last topic, and that is you're an endurance athlete, and this is the Project Endure podcast. And so endurance could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. To you, when you hear the word endurance, what does that mean to you?
So someone who's an incredible endurance athlete, right, is someone who's able to withstand stress, right? That's the way that I've always talked about it in that context, right? So endurance to me, right, is the ability to endure stress. And the people who can do that the best typically end up being the best athlete in that realm, right? And so the mantra that ran through my head when I was running cross country, and again, that did not come naturally to me. I was not good. I really had to work at it. The question that I would ask myself often was just, how bad do you want it, right? And to me, that was completely in line with the idea was who was able to endure more pain, who is able to endure more stress, who was willing to sit in that world longer, right? And most days I was not going to tap first, right? There were plenty of dudes who were much more physically gifted in that realm. Didn't matter to me. It was either going to be me or you, and it wasn't going to be about who was faster. It was about who was willing to quit last. So the best endurance athletes are the ones who are willing to quit last, the ones who are willing to suffer longer. And I really prided myself on that ability, because to me, that's true toughness, right? If you can endure, if you can really sustain that threshold of pain, if you can tolerate that, then ultimately you're going to outlast others. You're going to outperform others. And it's not necessarily a me versus you thing, right? Sometimes it's just a you versus you, because you got to endure those hardships long enough to see the other side, to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think if you can do that, right, you don't even know what's on the other side. You don't. What is that saying, Joe, that they talk about, like on the other side of pain is freedom or something like that?
Something like that? That's one of the few that I don't have on top of my tongue, but yeah.
We understand what we're talking about, right? Like if you can put yourself in the arena, mm-hmm. and you can deal with hard shit head on, right? On the other side of that, you are going to be a different version of yourself. You're going to be better for it. It's just a fact. Every instance that I gave you guys tonight is evidence, is truth of that, right? Got, you name it, dealt with my family, got through that, had a different perspective from it, right? Got through rehab, got sober, had a much different perspective after that. Dealt with the loss of my dad, dealt with the loss of my brother. Every single one of these things has molded me into the person that I am, and for the better. So when we go back and we say, why did that happen? Why did that happen? I don't know. I'm not going to ever know. I'm not going to be able to say, ooh, that happened because of this. But all of these things, all of the hardships that I've faced in life have happened, and they've made me a better person because of it. So if that's why they happened, right? That's a little bit more big picture, right? Then fine, right? Because it's made me who I am today. And the takeaway for me with that is I better do something with that.
Yeah.
Because not everybody gets the opportunity to go through what I've gone through, come out the other side, and use that and leverage that, not only for my benefit, but for the world's. And that might be hyping it up more than it needs to be hyped up, but I believe it, in that what we're building now with these gyms and with the coaching and all of that stuff, these are catalysts for change in other people's lives. I'm taking what I've been through. I'm taking what I've learned. I'm taking the perspective I have, and I'm using these gyms to infuse that so that people can really use it and go take with it, take it as they may. Right. And hopefully, again, they don't have to go through what I've gone through to learn what I've learned, and now use it in their own way.
Yeah. And I can see that happening. And I think anybody who watches what you're doing can see that happening. And, I am asking all my guests the same question at the end, which is, what would you tell someone who's listening, who's going through a really hard time right now? And I think, honestly, you answered that question about 10 times throughout the course of this podcast. So I'm going to ask you a quick one, but a different one. One of the things that I think can be difficult when we're going through something is we compare it to what other people are going through or how other people have handled things. And I know from our conversations that you like to say hard is hard, right? Someone else is hard. It might not look like you're hard, but it's hard to them. So if you could just speak to somebody who's maybe feeling a little down because their problems aren't that big, but they're still struggling with them, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, 100%. We often talk about this as like, again, I hate to use running analogies, but running 100% for me is the same as running 100% for you. It hurts equally for both, exerting ourselves to our max capacity. Same thing goes when you're dealing with, the shitstorm of life, right? Like, listen, what was hard for me in those moments was the biggest thing in my life at that time, right? Again, as things progress, those contexts change, but when you're dealing with something tough, man, it's tough for you, period. Right. And no one should ever discount that. It's not about like, oh, well, my situation's worse than yours. Like, listen, at the end of the day, we're all dealing with something. Right. So if you're somebody who's listening to this and you're struggling, I get it. How's that for number one? I understand. Right. And if somebody has a strong perspective, I think that they would also understand. Right. But as a coach and as somebody who's been through it and will continue to go through it, that ultimate truth, right, is at the end of the day, you got to take the reins. You got to acknowledge that you're not happy with how things are going. You got to acknowledge what's within your control in the situation, and you got to go do something about it. That's it. And it is that simple. And it does not matter what it is. You control what you can control. Stop worrying about the shit you can't. Stop creating false narratives in your head. Stop making assumptions. Deal with what you can deal with, right? More often than not, that's just simply giving meaning to the situations, right? Keeping kind of perspective as perspective and saying, okay, this is the situation at hand. This is what I can do about it. I'm going to go do it. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it hurts, even if it's whatever, right? It's on you. Joe can't do it for you. I can't do it for you. Mom can't do it for you. Your brother, your sister, your friend, your girlfriend, your wife, whatever. If you got something that's bothering you, you got to attack it.
I mean,
not discounting it, not discounting that it's not saying it's easy, acknowledging it's hard and saying you still have to go do it anyways.
It's going to be hard to top this podcast, man.
You ain't topping this podcast.
Well, hey, Sam, I appreciate it. Your authenticity, vulnerability, and strength is just, it always inspires me. And I'm ready to do this again sometime soon, meaning in the next 5 minutes, we'll do this again with somebody else. But thank you. If the people want to connect with you or find you, follow along, where's the best place for that?
So on the gram, Coach.Sam Tooley on the gram, and then the Pursuit podcast, if you want to listen to me curse a little bit more. And that's really it. And then if you're local to Jersey, we got Alpha Fit Clubs. If you want to join the fam, we got them in Westfield, Red Bank, and Verona, and many more coming. So be on the lookout.
Awesome, Sam. Thank you. Appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode of the Project Indoor podcast, go ahead and subscribe, leave a review on your platform of choice, and share this episode with a friend. It helps us get more conversations like this out to more people like you. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time. Oh, and one more thing. If you're looking for a community of people all striving to be better together, check out the Project Indoor Hard Things Club. The link is in the description below. We'd love to have you.